Imagine stepping into a home where the air reeks of formaldehyde and forgotten prayers, where the family who lays your loved ones to rest might be the ones who sent them to God too soon. In 1823 Pennsylvania, one funeral parlor hid a darkness that twisted mercy into murder, a legacy of sin that still whispers warnings from the grave. Dare you enter? In the shadowed valleys of southeastern Pennsylvania, where the autumn leaves bled crimson against the iron-gray sky, the year 1823 unfolded like a slow unraveling shroud. Millbrook wasn't just a town. It was a fragile web of lives woven from the soil, farmers tilling earth hardened by frost, loggers felling ancient oaks that groaned like dying men, and families huddled around hearth fires that flickered uncertainly against the encroaching night. Here, death was as familiar as the harvest, a visitor that came with the chill winds or the fevered sweat of illness. But in Millbrook, death had a name, a face, a family: the Hartwells. Their stone manor on the town's ragged edge stood as a sentinel over the living and the dead, its windows glowing with lantern light that promised solace but concealed something far more profane. Ezekiel Hartwell, the patriarch, was a man carved from the same unyielding granite as his home. Tall and gaunt, with eyes like polished obsidian that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He had arrived in 1801 like a biblical wanderer, claiming land and purpose from the wilderness. His hands, calloused from hammer and chisel, built coffins that cradled the departed with an almost reverent precision. Yet those same hands, in the quiet hours, might have clenched around throats or measured poisons with the care of a sacrament. His wife, Martha, moved through their world like a ghost in calico, her face etched with lines that spoke of burdens unspoken, perhaps the weight of secrets or the hollow ache of a soul bartered to darkness. Their children, Josiah, the heir apparent, with his father's sharp gaze but a tremor in his smile that hinted at inner fractures. Caleb, broad-shouldered and silent, whose axe split wood with the finality of judgment. And Rebecca, the youngest, her porcelain skin and wide eyes masking a wisdom that curdled like milk left in the sun. The Hartwell funeral parlor wasn't merely a business. It was an altar to mortality, a place where the veil between life and eternity thinned to transparency. The main floor, with its polished oak viewing room, smelled of beeswax candles and wilting lilies, the air thick with the muffled sobs of mourners. Upstairs, bedrooms whispered of domestic normalcy. Quilted beds, a family Bible open on a nightstand, verses underlined in faded ink about dust returning to dust. But below, in the basement's damp embrace, lay the heart of their domain. Stone walls slick with condensation, tables scarred from countless preparations, and shelves lined with jars that glinted under flickering oil lamps. Here, the dead were undressed, washed, embalmed, their bodies vessels for fluids that preserved flesh while rotting the soul of those who wielded the needles. What bound the community to the Hartwells wasn't just necessity. It was a twisted thread of gratitude and obligation. In lean winters, when blizzards howled like vengeful spirits and pantries echoed empty, Ezekiel accepted barter over coin. A bushel of corn for a child's burial, labor in the fields for a pauper's plot. Martha's pies, warm and laced with cinnamon, arrived at doorsteps during times of trial, her visits a balm that masked a deeper hunger. The family attended the Methodist chapel every Sabbath, heads bowed in piety, voices raised in hymns that praised divine mercy. But in the pews, whispers stirred. Was it coincidence that the Hartwells always seemed to know when death hovered near? That their wagon rattled up dusty lanes before the last breath escaped? The era itself pulsed with unrest, a young nation stretching its limbs toward progress while clinging to old fears. The Erie Canal's distant promise echoed like thunder on the horizon, threatening to flood these rural havens with strangers and change. Revival tents sprouted in fields, preachers thundering about sin and redemption, their words igniting souls like dry tinder. In Millbrook, faith was a shield against the unknown. The plagues that swept from city ports, the moral decay whispered in taverns. The Hartwells embodied stability, guardians of the rights that honored the fallen, stewards of grief. Yet beneath this facade, a spiritual malignancy festered. What if their compassion was a lure, drawing the vulnerable into a web where mercy twisted into malice, where the act of burial became a profane ritual echoing ancient tales of judgment and retribution. The unraveling began not with a scream, but with the measured tread of boots on a frost-cracked path. On October 15, 1823, Dr. Samuel Harrison rode into Millbrook under a sky bruised with impending rain. A state-appointed sentinel against disease, he was a man of science tempered by faith. Spectacles perched on a hawkish nose, coat pockets bulging with instruments that probed the mysteries of flesh. His annual inspections were ritualistic, testing well water for foulness, scrutinizing granaries for mold, examining the dead for signs of contagion that could devour a town like locusts. The Hartwell parlor was his final stop, a courtesy extended to propriety. Greeted at the door by Ezekiel and Josiah, their faces masks of geniality, Harrison felt the air shift, thicker, somehow, laced with the metallic tang of chemicals and something sweeter, almost cloying. The tour commenced. Preparation rooms gleaming with order, tools laid out like surgical sacraments. "We honor the departed as vessels of God," Ezekiel intoned, his voice a low rumble that vibrated the floorboards. But Harrison's eye caught anomalies. The way shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, the faint scratch marks on a table's edge, as if fingers had clawed in desperation. He demanded to see the bodies awaiting interment, invoking the law born from cholera's grim harvest. First, Eleanor Fairchild, widow of 68, claimed by consumption's relentless cough. Her form lay serene in lace, but as Harrison peeled back the collar, his fingers trembled. Bruises bloomed along her throat, purple petals in the shape of hands, not the pallid waste of lungs drowning in their own fluid. "Post-mortem artifact," Josiah murmured, his breath quickening, eyes darting to his father like a supplicant seeking absolution. But Harrison pressed on, the room growing colder, the lantern flames guttering as if recoiling. Next, Marcus Webb, 42, felled by a heart's betrayal in Golden Fields. His skin, marbled with veins, bore punctures, precise as stigmata, clustered on arms and chest. Not the ragged tears of a fall onto tools, but deliberate incisions, perhaps for bleeding out life under guise of cure. Ezekiel's explanation faltered, his hands clasping like in prayer, but Harrison smelled the lie, acrid as smoke. The damning revelation came with Mary Patterson, 26, mother torn from her babes by fever's fire. Around her lips and nails, a dusting of white arsenic, that silent reaper peddled as rat poison, its crystals glittering like fallen stars. Harrison's mind raced. Symptoms masked as illness, a family's visits turning fatal. The basement yielded more horrors. Jars of organs suspended in amber fluid, hearts and livers sectioned with unholy precision. "For study," Ezekiel claimed, but the freshness screamed recent harvest, not scholarly pursuit. A journal peeked from beneath shrouds, pages crammed with notations. Widow Fairchild, isolated, estate modest but land fertile. Webb, debts mounting, no kin to question. Caleb's bulk interposed, his shadow engulfing the book like a demon claiming its tome. As Harrison emerged into the fading light, the Hartwell gaze followed. Martha's eyes predatory slits, Rebecca's innocent facade cracking to reveal a knowing glint. At the inn that night, scratching parchment under candle sputter, whispers found him. Townsfolk gathered, faces etched with doubt and dread. My mother thrived until Martha's soups, healthy men dropping like autumn leaves. They arrive before the doctor, as if summoned by angels or devils. The spiritual undercurrent gnawed at Harrison. Was this mere greed or something deeper? A perversion of stewardship, where the Hartwells played God, meting out judgment on the weak? Biblical echoes haunted him. Cain's mark, Judas's kiss, the wages of sin manifest in poisoned chalices. In a town where trust was scripture, the Hartwells had inscribed their own gospel of death, their home a tabernacle of terror. The air in Millbrook thickened with unspoken accusations, the wind carrying moans that might have been ghosts or guilt. Harrison's report, sealed with trembling wax, would ignite a reckoning. But the shadows in that basement whispered that some sins burrowed too deep to uproot, lingering like curses in the earth. Yet the Hartwells' darkness wasn't born in isolation. It sprouted from seeds sown in their past. Ezekiel's arrival in 1801 masked a flight from whispers in Philadelphia. Rumors of a botched apprenticeship, bodies vanishing from morgues. Martha's lineage traced to Puritan stock, where witch trials had scorched family trees, leaving scars of fanaticism. Their children, raised amid cadavers, learned death's intimacy not as loss, but as power, a divine right to cull the flock. Josiah's hands, steady with the embalmer's needle, trembled only when conscience flickered, drowned in scripture twisted to justify. "The Lord giveth and taketh," he'd murmur, but who appointed him the taker? The community's blind faith amplified the horror. In an age of revival, where sermons railed against moral decay, the Hartwells cloaked their deeds in piety. Rebecca's gentle comforts to widows masked assessments of vulnerability. Lonely hearts ripe for merciful ends. Caleb's graves, dug deep, swallowed secrets with the soil. And Thomas Creed, Martha's father, hunched in his rocker by the fire, his rheumy eyes holding memories of older atrocities, perhaps the architect of their familial curse. As Harrison's suspicions coalesced, the town stirred uneasily. Children whispered of lights in the Hartwell windows at midnight, silhouettes dancing like demons. Farmers noted livestock sickening after Hartwell visits, crops withering under unseen blight. Was it poison seeping into wells, or divine retribution for harboring evil? The spiritual chill deepened. Dreams plagued Millbrook, visions of the dead rising, fingers pointing at the living who had entrusted their souls to murderers. In the parlor's viewing room, where bodies lay in state, the air hummed with unspoken maledictions. Mirrors draped in black to trap spirits, but perhaps they reflected the Hartwells' own fractured souls, guilt manifesting as apparitions in the glass. The basement, with its chemical vapors rising like incense, became a profane confessional, where admissions of sin mingled with the drip of fluids from lifeless veins. Harrison, alone in his room, pondered the moral abyss. Science demanded evidence, but faith screamed of judgment overdue. The Hartwells' obsession with death transcended livelihood. It was a ritualistic devotion, each killing a step toward some twisted redemption. Arsenic as communion wine, strangulation as baptismal immersion, perversions that mocked the divine. The next days blurred into tension. Harrison summoning the constable, a grizzled veteran named Elias Thorne, whose skepticism melted under the weight of details. Searches loomed, but the Hartwells, sensing the noose, tightened their facade. Smiles sharper, eyes darker. Martha's pies ceased, replaced by locked doors and watchful vigils. In this cauldron of suspicion, emotional currents surged. Dread coiling in bellies like serpents, curiosity drawing neighbors closer despite fear. Empathy for victims swelled. Eleanor's solitary end, Marcus's orphaned fields, Mary's babes wailing for a mother's touch. Reflection gripped the town. How had trust blinded them to evil in their midst? Biblical parables resurfaced in sermons. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the hidden leaven of sin. The Hartwells' legacy, once of compassion, now reeked of betrayal, a haunting that would echo through generations. Buried records, sealed by shame, but truths like these never truly die. They fester, waiting for exhumation. In Millbrook's misty dawns, one might still hear the creak of a wagon, the whisper of a prayer twisted into curse. A reminder that in the house of horrors, divine justice lingers, patient and inexorable. The chill of autumn deepened in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, as if the earth itself sensed the rot burrowing beneath its surface. Leaves, once vibrant in their fall blaze, now crunched underfoot like brittle bones, and the wind carried a metallic tang from the river, mingling with the ever-present scent of pine sap and wood smoke from distant chimneys. It was a time when lanterns guttered early against the encroaching dusk, and families drew curtains tight, whispering prayers against the unknown. In this insular world, Dr. Samuel Harrison found himself ensnared in a web of deception that stretched back through the decades, its threads woven from the very fabric of trust and piety that bound the community. His initial discoveries, the bruises on Eleanor Fairchild's throat like fingerprints of the damned, the puncture wounds on Marcus Webb's flesh evoking the thorns of Christ's crown, The arsenic dusting Mary Patterson's lips as a bitter Eucharist were mere harbingers. As he probed deeper, the Hartwells' facade cracked, revealing a lineage of sin that mocked the divine order, turning caretakers into reapers of souls. The Hartwells' origins whispered of Exodus and enigma, a migration from the shadowed hollows of Western Virginia in 1801, where Ezekiel claimed apprenticeship under a Richmond undertaker whose name faded from records like a ghost. They arrived in Millbrook not on weary wagons, but with a purse heavy with gold coins that gleamed unnaturally bright, as if forged in some alchemical fire rather than earned through honest toil. The property they claimed was no idle purchase. It came from the estate of a landowner felled by sudden apoplexy, his body the first to pass through Ezekiel's hands. That inaugural winter, a scourge descended, a wasting sickness that clawed at 8 souls. Their symptoms a cascade of fevered delusions, convulsing limbs, and breaths that rattled like chains in the night. All were entrusted to the Hartwells, their bodies laid out in the parlor's viewing room under the soft glow of tallow candles, mourners none the wiser to the subtle alchemy at play. Over the ensuing years, anomalies flickered like will-o'-the-wisps in the collective memory. A farmer's wife, robust and ruddy-cheeked, wilted after Martha's comforting broths, her decline swift as a biblical plague. An itinerant preacher, seeking shelter, vanished into the Hartwells' hospitality, his sermons on redemption silenced forever. Whispers circulated in the tavern's haze of pipe smoke. How the family materialized at bedsides unbidden, their offers of aid laced with an eagerness that bordered on predation. How they insisted on haste in burials, citing scripture about the corruption of flesh, dissuading autopsies with tales of divine mystery. Yet in a hamlet where barn raisings forged bonds and church bells summoned unity, such doubts dissolved like mist at dawn. The Hartwells embodied the Protestant virtues: diligence, charity, restraint. Their generosity a balm that soothed suspicions. Who could accuse pillars of the community, attendees at every revival where preachers railed against Satan's snares? But beneath the parlor's floorboards, in the basement's clammy depths, lay the sanctum of their sacrilege. Dr. Harrison, in his initial sweep, had glimpsed only the veneer, jars of preservatives shimmering like unholy relics, tools aligned with surgical precision. Unseen, concealed behind a panel of weathered oak, it seems masked by cobwebs and shadow, was a chamber that defied the light of God. Shelves groaned under vials of toxins, arsenic crystals glinting like fallen manna, strychnine powders fine as communion wafers, belladonna extracts dark as Judas's kiss. Instruments gleamed, scalpels honed to whisper through sinew, forceps curved like demonic talons, syringes that pierced veins with the subtlety of temptation. Anatomical sketches adorned the walls, inked in faded sepia. Bodies splayed in crucifixion poses, organs labeled with clinical detachment, notes on agony's stages evoking the stations of the cross perverted into torment. At the heart of this abyss rested the journal, a tome bound in leather cured from hides that might have once wrapped innocence. Its pages, yellowed and ink-stained, chronicled not mere deaths, but orchestrated descents. Entries spanning hands. Ezekiel's bold script, Martha's precise cursive, Josiah's measured loops, even Rebecca's nascent flourishes. It was a ledger of the damned, detailing over 40 souls harvested like wheat for the threshing floor. Victims were catalogued with predatory insight. The isolated elder whose will named no heirs, the debtor drowning in shame, the traveler adrift from kin. Selection criteria unfolded like a dark catechism. Vulnerability as virtue, obscurity as grace. Spacing was meticulous. Murders timed to the rhythm of seasons, lest patterns provoke divine scrutiny or human alarm. One entry, penned by Josiah in the flickering lamplight, dissected Marcus Webb's end with the cold eye of a vivisectionist. Webb, a widower whose fields abutted the Hartwell domain, was enticed with talk of communal burial plots, his trust a fatal flaw. In the parlor's hush, he was subdued, perhaps with a cloth soaked in ether, his struggles muffled by the thick stone walls. The experimental procedures followed. Incisions testing resilience, poisons gauging thresholds, observations on the soul's departure etched in clinical prose. His body, staged in the fields under a harvest moon, mimicked cardiac rupture, a mockery of the heart's betrayal in Eden. Financial spoils were noted, deeds pocketed, valuables melted. But the true harvest was knowledge, a Faustian pursuit of death's secrets that blurred the line between science and sorcery. Motivations swirled in the journal like vapors from a cauldron. Greed as the base alloy, but alloyed with a deeper malaise. Robberies sustained their facade. Gold teeth extracted like offerings, jewels fenced in distant markets. But the core pulsed with obsession. Entries pondered reactions to terror. The widening eyes mirroring Saul's blindness. The final gasps echoing the thief on the cross. Was it psychopathy, inherited like original sin, or a gradual corruption? Each kill eroding the soul's barriers until redemption seemed a distant myth? Martha emerged as the serpent in this garden. Her matronly guise a perfect veil. She infiltrated hearths with pies and poultices, her conversations probing weaknesses like a confessor drawing out sins. Poisons slipped into stews, symptoms ascribed to providence. Her victims expiring in beds she tucked with feigned tenderness. The progeny were acolytes in this cult of demise. Caleb, with his blacksmith strength, mastered restraint and disposal. His graves dug deep as Gehenna. Josiah honed the art of staging, transforming violence into natural cessation. Rebecca, blooming into womanhood amid cadavers, scouted at quilting bees and revivals, her innocent queries unmasking isolation. A lamb among wolves, or perhaps the wolf in lamb's wool. Their integration into Millbrook's tapestry amplified the horror. Pumates by day, predators by night. Their hymns praising mercy while plotting its inversion. This duality suggested a fracture in the human spirit, a compartmentalization where sin festered unchecked, defying the biblical call to wholeness. By autumn 1823, hubris swelled like a river in flood. The prior winter's famine had sown vulnerability. Families gaunt, debts mounting. Ripe for the Hartwells' charity. Emboldened by impunity, they accelerated, their ledger filling faster, the basement's air thickening with the residue of experiments. It was this boldness that summoned Dr. Harrison, a unwitting instrument of judgment. Harrison's quandary gnawed at him in the inn's sparse room, the fire's crackle mocking his turmoil. Evidence mounted like stones for a cairn, yet accusation risked shattering the community's faith. A charge against the elect that echoed the trials of Salem, where suspicion devoured innocence. His tour beckoned, departure imminent, but conscience, that divine spark, demanded action. Providence intervened in the form of Thomas Creed, Martha's sire, his frame bent like a willow under storm. Requesting consultation away from the parlor's watchful eyes, they convened in the stable's hay-scented gloom, lanterns casting spectral halos. Creed's facade shattered. "You see the marks, doctor, the devil's handwriting on flesh. But the tale runs deeper, a river of blood fed by my own kin." His confession unfolded like a scroll of judgment, exceeding Harrison's nightmares. Poisoned incrementally, Creed had discerned the taint. Bitter notes in tea, cramps like Judas's bowels bursting, and countered with emetics gleaned from folk wisdom. The family's genesis. Grave desecration for profit, exhuming under moonless skies, stripping shrouds and trinkets. Evolution came in 1807, an accidental slaying during a pilfering, concealed as fate's decree. Success bred ambition, murders blooming like thorns, over 40 documented, networks in adjacent hamlets funneling transients, the vulnerable, the forgotten. Credence flowed from details. Fairchild's garrote gasps in the night, Webb's vivisected screams stifled by gags, Patterson's slow dissolution under Martha's care. A clandestine ossuary lurked in the woods, pines whispering over a pit where a dozen lay, travelers lured by hearth light, their bones commingled in unhallowed earth. Creed's betrayal stemmed from self-preservation and revulsion, a dawning horror at the abyss, coupled with his impending obsolescence. He proffered a pact, a key to the sanctum, access during Sabbath services when the family knelt in hypocrisy. Harrison would document, Creed flee to Philadelphia's anonymity, his absence chalked to senility. Sleepless, Harrison wrestled angels, the crime's magnitude a blight on creation, exposure a scourge on the innocent. Yet inaction abetted evil, a sin of omission damning as commission. Danger loomed. The Hartwells' gaze had turned predatory, past kills shielding secrets. Their plan crystallized. Infiltration under worship's cover, evidence seized, flight before retribution. November's dawn broke leaden, frost etching windows like accusatory script, as Millbrook stirred for services. Church bells tolled, a knell for the unsuspecting, while shadows lengthened over the parlor. A harbinger of reckoning where divine justice, long deferred, prepared to descend like Elijah's fire. In this crucible, emotions surged. Dread coiling in Harrison's gut like serpents in the garden, curiosity of forbidden fruit, empathy for the slain swelling like lamentations. Reflection haunted. How does evil flourish in piety's soil? Biblical echoes resounded, Pharisees whitewashing tombs, the beam in one's eye, a spiritually chilling reminder that sin's legacy endures, haunting generations, demanding atonement in blood or truth. The Hartwells' perversion twisted stewardship into dominion, each kill a rebellion against the Creator's monopoly on life. Creed's whisper ignited the fuse, but the explosion would test souls. Redemption for the betrayer, justice for the victims, or eternal damnation for the unrepentant. In Millbrook's misty vale, the air hummed with anticipation, ghosts stirring as if sensing the veil's tear. Expanded, the narrative delved into psychological depths. Ezekiel's patriarchal authority, a corrupted Abrahamic sacrifice. Martha's maternal facade echoing Jezebel's guile. The children's indoctrination mirrored the fall, innocence lost in incremental bites. Historically, it anchored in era's fears. Post-revolutionary isolation breeding paranoia, revival stirring moral fervor, medical naivety allowing poisons to masquerade as providence. The basement, a modern Gehenna, symbolized descent, literal and spiritual, where experiments probed the soul's fragility, questioning if death revealed God's design or man's hubris. Harrison, as reluctant prophet, embodied the call to expose iniquity, his dilemma a microcosm of faith's trials. As the congregation filed into pews, hymns rising like incense, the parlor stood sentinel. Its secrets poised for revelation, a testament to sin's tenacity and justice's inexorable march. The night before the Sabbath, Dr. Samuel Harrison did not sleep. He sat at the scarred oak table in the Millbrook Inn, candle guttering low, the flame trembling like his own heart. Pages of frantic notes lay scattered before him. Sketches of bruise patterns shaped like praying hands, chemical formulae for arsenic mixtures, the names Eleanor Fairchild, Marcus Webb, Mary Patterson written over and over as if repetition might resurrect them. Every creak of the old inn's timbers sounded like footsteps on the stairs. Every gust against the shutters felt like the breath of the Hartwells themselves, come to silence him before he could cry murder. Thomas Creed's key, small, black iron, ornate as a coffin handle, lay on the table like a relic from some forbidden sacrament. With it came instructions whispered in the sour darkness of the stable. Wait until the family is seated in church. Slip through the outside basement door, find the false stone, open the compartment, photograph the evidence with your mind and your pencil, then flee. 3 hours. No more. 3 hours to prove that the most respected family in the county had turned death into their private liturgy. Sunday dawned iron cold. A skim of frost silvered the pumpkin fields and glazed the gravestones behind the Methodist chapel. From his hiding place among the pines, Harrison watched the Hartwells emerge from their stone house as though stepping out of a daguerreotype of perfect Christian domesticity. Ezekiel led the procession in solemn black broadcloth, tall and terrible as an Old Testament prophet. Martha followed, bonnet tied with funereal ribbon, her face serene as a marble Madonna, the same face that had spooned poison into dying lips while murmuring psalms. Josiah and Caleb walked ramrod straight, Bibles clutched like weapons. And Rebecca, sweet, lethal Rebecca, in dove-gray wool, curls escaping her bonnet like innocent ringlets, eyes bright with the excitement of a girl on her way to Sunday school. They smiled at neighbors. They patted children's heads. They were the picture of virtue incarnate. Harrison waited 30 agonizing minutes after the last hymn floated across the valley. Then he moved. The basement door opened with a sigh, as though the house itself exhaled centuries of rot. Inside, everything was exactly as he remembered from the official inspection. Spotless embalming tables, orderly rows of jars, the faint perfume of wintergreen and decay, a mockery of sanctity. He found the false stone low on the eastern wall, a slab no different in appearance from its neighbors until the key slid home with a click that sounded, in the silence, like the cocking of a pistol. The panel swung inward on concealed hinges, and the air that rolled out was warm, humid, alive with the stench of formaldehyde and something sweeter, the copper-bright reek of old blood. The hidden chamber was vast, carved beneath the house and into the living hill itself. Oil lamps hung from chains, their flames trembling in an unfelt draught. And everywhere were the relics of their blasphemy. Hundreds of glass jars marched along the walls like soldiers in hell's apothecary. Hearts floated in yellow fluid. Livers curled like sleeping adders. Eyes, dear God, human eyes, stared out with the dull fixity of the damned, each jar labeled in neat copperplate. Male 47, nightshade, 12 minutes to fixed pupils. Female 19, manual asphyxia, exquisite terror response. On a lectern of dark walnut rested the journal, thick as a family Bible, bound in leather that Harrison now suspected had once been human skin. He opened it with shaking fingers. Page after page of meticulous horror unfolded. 1807. Their first deliberate kill. A consumptive farmer named Obadiah Green, accidental overdose during grave robbery turned to profit. 1812. Twin experiments on itinerant preachers, comparing strychnine convulsions to religious ecstasy. 1820. Rebecca's first solo selection. A lonely widow who left her farm to charity, i.e., the Hartwells. 1823. The current harvest. 17 names already crossed out in fresh crimson ink. There were maps, too. Delicate ink diagrams of 6 Pennsylvania counties, each marked with tiny black coffins, portable death carried to neighboring towns under the guise of funeral services. They had perfected the art of the traveling reaper. Harrison's pencil flew across his own notebook, copying, sketching, heart hammering so violently, he feared the family might hear it through the floorboards above. Then voices, at first distant, muffled by the Sabbath quiet. Then closer, boots on the porch, the unmistakable rumble of Ezekiel's baritone, early, far too early. Something had gone wrong. He had been inside for 2 hours and 9 minutes. Time had betrayed him. The voices sharpened, angry, urgent. Rebecca's light soprano cut through. Grandfather is gone. He spoke to the doctor. Everything. A pause. Then Martha, soft as velvet over steel. Find him. Bring him to the preparation room. We have practiced the quick method. Harrison's blood turned to ice water. The only other exit lay beyond the specimen shelves, a low wooden door almost hidden by stacked crates of bones. He hurled himself toward it as the basement stairs began to creak under descending weight. The door opened into a tunnel, hand-hewn through living rock, so narrow his shoulders scraped the walls. The candle he had snatched guttered wildly, throwing shadows like pursuing demons. The air grew colder, damper, thick with the smell of earth and ending. 50 yards in, the tunnel spilled into a natural cavern, and Harrison stumbled into a cathedral of death. Moonlight leaked through a fissure high above, silvering the horror below. The cave floor was carpeted with bones. Skulls grinned from alcoves. Ribcages hung from chains like grotesque wind chimes. Some bodies were fresh enough for the flesh to cling in ragged strips. Others had been reduced to polished skeletons arranged in mocking poses. A mother cradling an infant, lovers locked in an eternal embrace, a preacher with arms raised to a heaven that had abandoned him. On stone shelves lay the newest trophies: Eleanor Fairchild's silver locket, Marcus Webb's farmer's clasp knife, Mary Patterson's wedding ring, all displayed like relics in a perverse reliquary. Harrison retched, but there was no time. Voices echoed behind him now, closer, lanterns bobbing in the tunnel mouth. Dr. Harrison, Ezekiel's voice calm, almost paternal. You should not have meddled with God's appointed stewards of death. Harrison ran. The cavern had 3 exits. He chose blindly, scrambling up a scree slope, thorns tearing his coat, until raw daylight blinded him. He burst into the pine woods above the house, lungs on fire, legs trembling like a deer's. From the ridge he saw them, 5 dark figures spreading out below, moving with the silent coordination of wolves. They knew these woods. They had hunted here before. Harrison fled west, abandoning horse, luggage, everything. For 3 days he moved only at night, sleeping in haystacks, drinking from streams, the stolen pages of the journal pressed against his heart like a crucifix. Behind him, rumor would later say, the Hartwells closed their parlor with sorrowful faces, claiming a dying aunt in Ohio required their immediate presence. Neighbors promised to watch the property. The wagon rolled out at dusk, piled high with crates that might have been furniture, or something that did not bear thinking about. And somewhere in the dark between Millbrook and the next town, Thomas Creed's broken body was found hanging from a tree, a confession carved into his chest with surgical precision. Elite. There is no evidence. But Dr. Harrison still carried the evidence. Pages soaked with sweat and terror, ink bleeding but legible. Pages that would one day reopen graves, shatter a community's faith, and brand the name Hartwell with a mark that not even hell itself could wash away. Because some sins do not die with their sinners. Some sins wait beneath the frost, patient as judgment, until the earth itself vomits them up. And somewhere out there, a respectable family in Sunday best was already choosing their next town. For 3 days Dr. Samuel Harrison ran like a man fleeing the wrath of God. Through frost-bitten forests, across half-frozen streams, coat torn to ribbons, boots bleeding, the stolen pages of the Hartwell journal pressed against his heart like a fragment of the true cross. Behind him, the stone funeral parlor stood hollowed and blind, its secrets packed into crates or burned to ash. The family wagon had rolled west at twilight, neighbors waving tearful goodbyes, believing the lie about a dying aunt in Ohio. By the time Harrison stumbled into Philadelphia and collapsed at the feet of a startled magistrate, the Hartwells had vanished as completely as smoke through a keyhole. What followed was a slow crucifixion of the truth. Philadelphia officials listened to the wild-eyed physician describe basement cathedrals of jars, caves carpeted with bones, a family that had murdered its way across Pennsylvania like a plague in Sunday clothes. They weighed the soot-smudged pages he clutched, fragments salvaged from hell, against the testimony of Millbrook's finest citizens. The Hartwells? Impossible. They buried my mother with such tenderness. They sat in the pew behind us every Sabbath for 20 years. They brought soup when the baby died. The cave had been collapsed with gunpowder, the hidden chamber bricked up and whitewashed. Thomas Creed's corpse, what little the wolves left, was found swinging from an oak, a carved confession on his chest that read like mockery. I lied. Without bodies, without the journal's missing volumes, without the family to hang, the case curdled into rumor, then legend, then silence. State files stamped it inconclusive. Millbrook nailed boards across the parlor windows and tried to forget the taste of its own blood. But some men cannot forget. Harrison spent the rest of his life chasing ghosts westward. 1824, a cluster of poisoned widows in Steubenville, Ohio. 1827, travelers vanishing outside Terre Haute, always after visiting a kindly new undertaker. 1832, a rash of heart failure deaths in a Missouri River settlement, the local funeral home run by a patriarch with obsidian eyes and a softly smiling daughter. Every time Harrison arrived, the wagon had rolled on. Every time he begged sheriffs to dig, they laughed at the mad doctor who saw murderers in every coffin nail. Millbrook itself began to die. Children grew up and left. Farms went fallow. By 1860, the forest had swallowed the chapel, the inn, the parlor, everything but memory. Old-timers crossing the overgrown trace would still cross themselves and hurry past the caved-in hillside, whispering that on certain autumn nights you could hear the faint chime of harness bells and smell embalming fluid on the wind. Then, in the winter of 1847, a letter reached Harrison in Pittsburgh, paper brittle as a dead man's skin, postmarked Oregon Territory. A sheriff named Macaulay wrote of a family called Caldwell who had run the only funeral parlor in a remote Willamette Valley settlement. For 3 years, grieving pioneers entrusted their dead to these gentle, scripture-quoting folk. Then a trapper stumbled out of the hills raving about a cave full of bones and jars of eyes. When the posse rode in, they found the basement laboratory intact. Pride had finally outrun caution. The Caldwells were the Hartwells, older, weathered by prairie sun and mountain snow, but unmistakable. Ezekiel, now 73, hair white as a patriarch's, still tall and terrible. Martha, face carved deep with decades of matronly deception. Josiah and Caleb, thick-necked and silent. Rebecca, 30 years after Millbrook, still beautiful, still lethal, still quoting psalms while measuring arsenic. They confessed, not in sorrow, in pride. 123 souls, by their own count, across 8 states and territories. They spoke of it like vintners discussing a particularly fine harvest. Ohio had excellent widows that first winter. Missouri gave us robust farmers, good for testing incision depth. Oregon's rainy season kept the bodies fresh longer. They had refined the craft to an art form. They had trained apprentices, 3 families, perhaps more, dispatched eastward and southward like dark missionaries carrying the gospel of profitable death. Harrison, 70 years old, bones aching from a lifetime of running, took the stagecoach west. On a December morning in 1847, beneath a sky the color of old pewter, he stood on the scaffold in Salem and looked into Ezekiel Hartwell's eyes one final time. The old man smiled, the same serene smile he had worn walking to church in Millbrook 44 years earlier. "You lasted longer than most, Doctor," he said, almost affectionately. "Tell me, do you still hear the bells on Sunday morning?" The trapdoor dropped. Ezekiel's neck snapped with the clean sound of a coffin lid closing. Martha followed, then Josiah. Caleb wasted away in a territorial prison, coughing blood onto straw. Rebecca, sweet, deadly Rebecca, died in her cell 4 years later, officially of consumption. The warden who signed the certificate refused ever to speak of what he saw in her eyes the night she died. Harrison went home to Pennsylvania and spent his remaining 5 years writing. Page after page after page, every date, every method, every name he could remember or reconstruct. He sealed the manuscript with black wax, addressed it to the Federal Archives, and wrote on the cover, "For the day when another respectable family opens a funeral parlor, and the bells ring again on Sunday morning." He died in 1853. The manuscript gathered dust in a Washington vault, classified alongside witch trial transcripts and reports of bleeding statues. And America kept moving west. New towns sprouted overnight. New funeral parlors rose, smelling of fresh pine and beeswax. New families arrived, soft-spoken, scripture-quoting, eager to help in times of grief. Sometimes, late at night, a traveler passing an isolated cemetery would hear the scrape of a shovel and the low murmur of voices that sounded almost like prayer. Sometimes a child would wake screaming from dreams of a beautiful woman in dove-gray wool, pressing a cool hand to his forehead and whispering, "Shoo! The Lord is calling you home." And somewhere, in a forgotten corner of some new territory, another ledger fills with neat copperplate entries. Victim, method, reaction, observations for future use. Because the Hartwells never really died. They multiplied, and the harvest continues.